Hello, and welcome back to another lecture series dealing with Chapter 10. And Chapter 10 talks about standard costs and variances. Now, we've already looked at variances in Chapter 9, right? We did the flex budget, the static planning budget, and we took our actual results and we compared all three to find out, okay, is there an activity variance? Is there a spending variance? Is there a revenue variance? So in this chapter, we're going to take that concept of spending variance, and we're going to drill down on it, and we're going to look at where did that variance come from? Meaning, did we spend too much money, or did we use too much of the input? Okay, so we're going to be able to calculate variance for direct materials, direct labor, and the variable portion of manufacturing overhead. Okay, so we're taking those variables, those variable inputs that we have, and we're going to look at them individually and say, okay, we have a variance. Is it because we maybe paid too much? We have a price, a difference in price based on what we should have paid, or is it an efficiency variance, meaning we used too much or we used less than we should have? Okay, so through these videos, I just kind of want to go through the definitions, the terminology of what's important and kind of what you need to know in order to work with these problems, and then we'll towards the end we'll go through a bunch of examples. Okay, so right now I'm just going to point out what's important, what definitions you need to know, kind of highlight those definitions, what's important. A lot of this will help as we go through this. A lot of these will address those study guide questions. So if there's any study guide questions that maybe you didn't get or couldn't figure out, we'll address those here. Okay, so first thing we got to look at is the basic definitions, right? So in Chapter 9, when we looked at the variance and calculated the spending variance or the revenue variance or the activity variance, we based our decisions on either a static budget or a flex budget based on those cost equations, right? So now what we're going to do in Chapter 10 is we're going to calculate what we actually spent, what we actually incurred based on the standards, right? What it should be, right? And the standards are nothing more than, benchmarks or the norm for measuring some performance. Okay, in our case it's going to be the spending performance or the implementation performance, right? So we're going to look at the standard price and the price standard and the quantity standard. The price standard, that just specifies how much should be paid for each unit of the input. Okay, so, and again, these are based on norms, right? Quantity standard, how much of an input should be used to make a product or provide a service. So let me give you an example. They use McDonald's. We're all familiar with McDonald's, right? Maybe some of us worked in fast food when we were younger. So you've ordered, let's just say, a Big Mac, or a Big Mac, right? You ordered a Big Mac from McDonald's, or at least seen them on TV, right? You might not know, but you know what goes on a Big Mac, right? They got 2 patties, 3 buns, some lettuce, some secret sauce on there. The point is, McDonald's has a standard for their Big Mac. Here's how much lettuce you should put on a sandwich or on a Big Mac. Here's the number of patties that you should put on those Big Macs. Here's the size of those patties. Here's the bun that you should be used, and it should be cut this way so you get three sections. Okay, they have standard prices for what they should pay for that from suppliers. Okay, so that's what we're doing. We're taking those standards of how it should be and comparing them to what we actually spent and what we actually used. Okay, if any of you guys were or gals, sorry, were either in the military or know somebody that was in the military. Um, the military has standards for everything, right? One student I had was, I think he was in the Marines, I think, or the Army. Anyways, doesn't matter. The point is, he says, you know, the whatever branch he was in, they had a manual for everything, right? Here's how you gas up a Humvee. Here's how much gas should be in the Humvee. Here's how long it should take you to gas up a Humvee. Here are the steps that you should take in order to fuel that Humvee, right? So they have those standards, and then they compare actual performance to those standards. That's basically what we're going to be doing here, okay? So let's look first at setting direct material standards, okay? So in order to set the standards, we need the standard price per unit and we need the standard quantity per unit, right? We need those two things. Where does the standard price per unit come from? Well, it's the final delivered cost of the materials, okay? We exclude any discounts, right? So where McDonald's and we order, I don't know, 3 dozen heads of lettuce, right? Well, we know how much we should be paying for each head of lettuce, okay? The standard quantity per unit, that comes from the bill of materials, right? We know, based on McDonald's, they probably have a little receipt card or recipe card that says you should use, you know, 4 ounces of lettuce or a 1/4 of a cup of lettuce, whatever, okay? From there, we got to set up our direct labor standards, okay? So we're going to have a standard rate per hour. We're going to have a standard hours per unit, right? Meaning, the standard, or let's work with standard hours first per unit. We know how long it should take us to make something, right? Whether that's a Big Mac, we know, or McDonald's knows, the standard of this is how long it should take you, just to use easy numbers, it should take you 1 minute to make a Big Mac, right? How do they know that? Well, they did time and motion studies, right? So they basically stood there with a stopwatch and said, okay, go ahead and make it, right? Make the Big Mac, and they timed them, and they developed their standards that way. The standard rate per hour, this is a single rate, and we're going to use a single rate, let's put it that way. But the problem is that single rate that we use is actually going to be a mix of wages earned, right? We might have some, so we're going to have a standard rate, let's say it's 12 bucks an hour, right? That's the standard or the average, right? We might have employees that make 12 bucks an hour. We might have employees, like senior employees, that make 15 bucks an hour, or we might have newbies that maybe make 8 bucks an hour, okay? So the important takeaway here is that standard rate, it's going to be a mixture of wages. Then we got to set up the variable MOH standard, right? We get a rate. Usually the rate is going to be the variable portion of the predetermined overhead rate, and we have a quantity standard, right? Again, we know how much overhead, variable overhead, we should be using in making a product, okay? Again, all of this comes from that predetermined overhead rate that we use, okay? The important takeaway from this is just that there are standards, right? There's a standard price for direct material, direct labor, manufacturing overhead. There's a standard quantity for all 3 of those inputs, right? DM, DL, and MOH, okay? So now what we have is a standard cost card, right? And basically all this is a record that we use as management that tells us here's how much a standard unit should cost, right? Or the standard cost of a unit. Let's say it that way, a standard cost of a unit. We use 3 pounds of direct material. That's the standard. That's what the specs call for. We might use more, we might use less, don't know, okay? In actuality is what I mean. In actuality, we might use more, we might use less, but the standards, the specifications say we should use 3 pounds, okay? Standard price or the standard rate, right? For direct material, it's $4 per pound. That's the standard cost. That's what we should pay. Is that what we actually pay? Well, maybe not, right? Maybe we pay more because we had to rush a shipment. So we get the standard cost of material that should be in a unit of product. Same thing with direct labor. Direct labor, we have the standard hours that we should use. We have the standard rate that we pay that direct labor. Okay. Here's the good news: if you can learn how to calculate standard quantity and standard price and calculate it out, you can just as easy calculate the total cost for labor, standard hours, and standard rate. As you're going to see, we're going to use different names, okay? Rate efficiency, quantity efficiency, right? It's all the same thing. We're just using different names, and that'll become very apparent when we start doing some examples here, okay? So again, standard cost card, it just gives us the standard cost per unit, and it takes all the inputs or the standard amount of inputs at that standard cost or that standard price or that standard rate. Okay, so what we're going to, and this is kind of what I talked about a little bit at the beginning of the video, looking at those standard costs, right, for DM, DL, and variable MOH. We're going to compute activity and spending variance for these. Okay, remember, when it comes to spending variance, we're basically breaking it down into two components: a price component and a quantity component, or a price variance and a quantity variance. So think about it this way: if we had taking maybe like a 100,000 foot view, it's spending variance. Okay, we're either favorable or unfavorable. Okay, good. Let's dip down a little bit. Let's maybe dip down to a 60,000 foot view. Now we could take that spending variance and we could say, oh, the spending variance is based on a price variance and a quantity variance. Okay. And here's a perfect example of what I was trying to verbally describe. We have our variance analysis, and we break it up between price and quantity. Okay, price variance, it's nothing more than the difference between the actual price and the standard price. Quantity variance, it's the difference between the actual quantity that we use versus the standard quantity that should be used. Okay. The reason why this is actually kind of important, and especially if you guys work in manufacturing or even like a service industry, breaking a variance down into price and quantity, there's two reasons why we do it. Number one, right, we have two different people responsible for kind of the same thing, so to speak, right, but different aspects of it. Okay, let's take, for example, direct materials, right? We have the production manager who's responsible for actually using that raw materials, and then we have the purchasing manager who's responsible for buying it. So if we have an unfavorable variance with regards to direct materials, who do we blame, right? Who do we go to and say, hey, you did bad, how are we going to fix this, right? Well, the purchasing manager, they're responsible for buying that raw materials, so they're responsible for the purchase price, right? Production manager, they're responsible for the quantity of that raw material used. Okay, and again, those two activities, buying and using, they occur at different times, right? Think about it. we may buy raw materials and hold them in inventory for 6 months or for a year, right, until they're used. When we're looking at price variance and quantity variance, we're going to calculate each of these for materials, labor, and variable overhead. Okay? Now, I want you to notice something, and this seems to be where some confusion, bear with me here, I just want to pull up my, where the heck is it? Well, I'll do it this way. Okay, so when we're looking at price variance, okay, if we're calculating the price variance for direct material, we call it materials price variance. If we're trying to calculate price variance for labor, we call it the labor rate variance. Okay, if we're trying to calculate price variance for variable overhead, we call that the variable rate or variable overhead rate variance. Okay, the point is, it's all price. It's all price variance that we're trying to calculate here. Don't get confused on the names. If you can calculate price variance for one of these, you can do it for the other two. Okay, it's the same calculation. We just use these different names. All right, it's kind of a pain in the butt. Quantity variance is the same thing, right? We're going to calculate quantity variance. But for materials, we call that materials quantity variance. Okay? But for labor, the quantity when we calculate quantity variance for labor or direct labor, we call that labor efficiency variance. Okay? How efficient are we using that labor? That's another way of saying what quantity of labor are you using. Okay? Same thing for variable overhead, right? If we're trying to figure out the quantity of variable or the quantity variance for variable overhead, we call that the variable efficiency variance. Don't get confused. At the end of the day, we're calculating the same exact thing, doing the same exact calculations. We just call them different names. Okay? And if you could do it for material, you could do it for labor, you could do it for variable overhead. Vice versa. If you could do it for variable overhead, you could do it for labor, and you could do it for materials. Okay? So not too bad. Now, we're going to come back. I want to kind of pause here, and we're going to come back and look at exactly how do we calculate price variance and quantity variance. Okay? And we're going to look at them through the lens of material, direct labor, and variable overhead. Okay? But the real takeaways from here, the thing that you should kind of have a decent understanding of, first of all, the names, right? Price variance, depending on what we're going to calculate, materials, labor, or variable overhead, they have different names. Same thing for quantity. Depending on what we're going to calculate, they have different names, whether it's efficiency variance or quantity variance. We're still calculating the difference, or we're still calculating the quantity variance. And these two, price variance and quantity variance, really make up our variance analysis. Let me see what else is. Knowing that we have standards and we establish the standards. Where these standards come from is very good thing to know. Okay? So when we come back in our next video, we're going to look at the general model of variance analysis, and this is one of your study guide questions. Okay, so we'll talk about this a little more and go from there. Okay, so tune back in for our next video.